Cool.
Cool. And I'm advanced the slide one here. Thank you, Siddharth. Okay, so this is our team who I want to acknowledge. So, and thank you for working on the tech, both of you. So Siddharth and I are co-authoring a piece on this along with John Carlisle, who's a PhD student in Asian languages and literatures. And we worked with a number of wonderful undergraduates without whom a lot of this data work wouldn't have been possible. So we're looking in particular at a text called the English Catalogue of Books. It was issued from the mid-19th century to the mid-20th century, and it intends to be a complete list of books published in England and Ireland each year, based on publishers' self-reported information. We were looking in particular at data from the early 20th century. Part of the reason we were interested in this catalog is that publishing data is often very hard to come by. So even though publishers have long used data on sales and circulation and number of editions to make decisions about what they want to publish, we as textual and literary scholars often don't have access to that data. So the data used in the contemporary publishing industry is locked up in a database called BookScan, which academics are explicitly not allowed to access. We've tried. And for historical publishing information, the information is often locked up in handwritten or printed records. So that's what motivated our work with this particular catalog. So though we are looking at a small publishing industry, we're looking at the publishing industry in England and Ireland up there above Europe. This publishing industry had a global reach due to systems of imperialism. So this is a map of areas under British governmental control at the beginning of the First World War in 1914. So the book industry way up there in England was exporting books in English all around the world, and also had a lot of influence on the trade policies in areas under British colonial control, as well as on like textual censorship, right? So that tiny island up there at the top has a huge amount of influence when it comes to English language publishing. At the time, this is the largest English language publishing industry in the world. So thank you for advancing the slides. So we wanted to get aggregate data on this publishing industry, right? There was a huge amount of growth in the publishing industry in England across the 19th century, due in part to that imperial conquest and the capitalist expansion that went alongside it. But in the period we're specifically looking at, this is 1911 to 1927, we can see that initially the publishing industry is growing. This is total books issued in England and Ireland, according to the English Catalogue of Books. But then it starts to go down. Does anybody have a guess about why we see this overall dip in publishing? Yeah? Exactly. So World War I, in 1914, it runs to 1918. The publishing industry shrinks for the first time in a long time. And it takes till 1923 again for it to reach the levels that it was at before. Looking at aggregate data can also help to provide context for the kinds of literary movements that we study in English departments. So this is a plot of books published each year broken down by genre. This down here, the blue, is poetry and drama. They combine them into one category, which is endlessly frustrating to me as a poetry scholar because I cannot now disaggregate that information. But this orange is fiction. So you can see how much more like novels were getting published than works of poetry. But everything else, right, is in non-literary genres. So those are expository texts. They might be tax codes or laws, books about art, those kinds of works. So this can kind of help us contextualize literary studies, literary texts within a broader field of print. If we want to get more granular than this, though, we need to dig into the publishing catalog. So that's what Siddharth and I were trying to do. We wanted to look at what individual books were getting published each year. So from 10 years of the English Catalogue of Books, we extracted information on 99,000 books issued at the time. That data includes book author, book title, book publisher, the format it was in, so the size of the book, and then also the month and year it was published. And we were able, using a combination of sort of traditional approaches, including regular expressions, along with the help of an LLM to parse through that information. So that is what we are going to be talking about. And just before I hand it over to Siddharth, this is what a page of the catalog looks like. And we are trying to extract individual entries from it that indicate when specific books were published. And one of the reasons this is important is if I'm studying Sarojini Naidu's The Bird of Time, I might just think, oh, that was published in 1912 when its first edition came out. But the English Catalogue of Books allows us to track each subsequent edition so we can see if it stayed in print, stayed popular, and kept being published. Thank you.
Cool. So like Anna mentioned, on the left is what the catalog looks like in its scanned version. And on the right is the OCR'd text that we have to work with, the plain text that we get after HathiTrust OCRs it. So very obviously, we need to try to parse out all of this information, and we're interested eventually in figuring out these single entries. So the problem is that as you look at these entries, there are a lot of different patterns that you can try to match, try to extract these entries. But first we have to kind of understand what the forms of entries that exist within a catalog such as this. So each title is mentioned twice in the catalog, and there are two forms under which they're listed. So one form contains the name of the publisher and generally contains more information than other entries. These entries usually begin with the name of the author first. Then there are other entries that usually contain fewer information that begin with the name of the title. So each title has what we call an author first and what we call a title first entry. So the author first entry, which we also we've been referring to them as main entries because that's what we're interested in. Those are the ones that contain more information, and especially importantly, they contain the name of the publisher in addition to some other stuff about format, etc. So while ultimately we are interested in main entries, we still need to extract entries out of this, and a lot of the early parsing is invested in that. So to try to do that, we started to look for patterns. So there are certain repeated formats and structures all through these entries, and a lot of those repetitions kind of lured us into thinking there might be a pattern there. But there is a lot of inconsistency in how these entries are recorded. But by far, the most consistent pattern is the placement of month and year of each entry. So each entry, whether a main entry or non-main entry, ends with the month and year of publication, as you can see in the slide over here. So we decided to look for month and year and try to find the end of an entry and split the OCR plain text into entries using that. So to do that, we did some good old-fashioned regular expressions. We looked for, as you can see there, that's like a non-word character followed by the year. So essentially, we're looking for either a space and 12 or apostrophe and 12 to find all the entries listed in the 1912 catalog. So there are a few problems in this because we can't just search for 12 to find all the entries in the 1912 catalog. So one of the reasons is OCR errors. OCR can cause 12 to be read in a few different ways. So for each year, we manually culled through sections of the catalogs to try to find all the different ways in which OCR might read the number 12. And we assembled a selection of possible spelling variations for 12. And as you can see, the spelling variations are up there. So there's I2, lowercase I to uppercase I to I lowercase z, I uppercase z, and so on. So these are meant to sort of capture a lot of OCR variations. The other problem is that sometimes the catalog has entries from the year before, so it'll have certain residual entries from December, November, sometimes even October of the previous year. So sometimes in the 1912 catalog, we might have entries from 1911, which we realized in the process of doing this. And so we had to go back and not only add in searches for 11, but also add in spelling variants for 11. So for each year, we sort of meticulously compiled all these spelling variations, having to balance the fact, of course, that we don't want to overcatch stuff as well. So if we have too many variations, we're catching all of these things and splitting at places where there aren't entries. So this whole project represented a significant amount of labor from Anna, from undergrad students and graduate students who worked as part of the lab over like 3 years, basically. But eventually, we identify these entries and we split on those entries. So now that we have a kind of block that is an entry, it could be main, it could be non-main. We want to check how well we're splitting these entries. So we do some manual checking for the entry splitting accuracy. And then we come up with measures to flag up merged entries, truncated entries, or mislabeled entries, or entries that we think are main but are not main. And essentially, like a lot of the early experimentation we do to try to split entries to begin with, the experimentation that maybe did not work in splitting entries ended up being very useful in helping us flag problematic entries. And then once we did that, we flagged about like 5,000 entries that were all then manually corrected. And that represents 5% of the entire data set. So this took a lot of manual correction and a bit of creative hacking to get to this point. And then what we ultimately are here for is to have an entry and parse it into these very useful categories, because we want this data to be useful for literary scholars. And for literary scholars, we want to be able to make these fields searchable. We want to have an author, a title, publisher, month, year, etc. So initially, we tried to parse these using regular expressions, but it was very difficult. It was very difficult to try to do that. And there are a few reasons. And I think the biggest reason is just that there are so many formatting inconsistencies. And a lot of those come from the publishers themselves. Publishers are not always formatting exactly the same way. But also, you have sometimes multiple authors listed. Sometimes you don't have authors listed. And you have maybe state-sanctioned publications, and you have the Department of such and such that's issuing something. So these kind of formatting inconsistencies made regular expression parsing really difficult, as well as the fact that there were OCR errors. So then what we eventually land on is using an LLM to parse. So the way we parse these entries is we used a lightweight Google Gemini model with few short prompting. Our prompt ended up being pretty long, I think, in my opinion, because there are so many special instructions, because there are so many formatting inconsistencies. And we had quite a few examples because there are so many weird edge cases. But eventually we had this prompt with the temperature set to 0, and it was very important to us to reduce LLM interference as much as possible. We wanted it just to parse, no copy edits. If something is in the wrong order, let it be in the wrong order. We wanted, if there were errors, let them be OCR errors and not LLM produced errors. So all of our instructions were geared towards that and towards parsing as well. So, this is a sort of quick look at our very lengthy prompt. We can return to this at the end if people are interested. This is just like the classic format. Here are all of our many special instructions. It's too small to even read right now, but we can talk about the specifics of it later if you're interested. And here are some of the examples we gave. So eventually, we have this LLM parsing that looks like it works pretty well. But there are two things we need to do. One is we need to check for data loss, and we need to do accuracy testing. So to check for data loss, we want to make sure the LLM has not moved things around, added things, removed things, whatever. So we do a pretty high threshold check to make sure to flag all entries with even 1 character worth of difference. And this is in terms of value and location. And this flags about 1,000 entries and those are all instances when the LLM had reordered stuff. So we end up manually correcting all of these 1,000 entries. And then we sort of rerun this check with the parsed entry and the original unparsed entry. And in our final form of the data set, there's not even a single character out of place through the process of the LLM parsing. But that's just for data loss. The next important step here was accuracy checking. Probably, arguably the most important thing here, because that's what we're interested in. But accuracy checking was a very hard problem. We tried some computational solutions. We tried some different approaches based on, generally ranges of locations within an entry of certain items, but the entry lengths are so inconsistent. There are all these, like, as I mentioned, formatting inconsistencies. So that was really hard to do. So we sort of did manual checking. We manually checked 1% of the database, of the data set. So that's about 1,000 entries. And in these 1,000 entries, 1% of those entries we found had a sort of recurring problem, which was in cases of corporate authorship. So sometimes you have entries where it's not a single human author, like we saw with Sarojini Naidu or Rabindranath Tagore, or like named authors, but it's departments. So if you can see here at the bottom, it says education board of, and then the title is regulations in force from August 1, et cetera, et cetera. So as a human, we would look at that and say, all right, the author, there's the Board of Education, and the title is the regulations in force. But the LLM, unfortunately, reads this as an extended title. It reads as Board of Education regulations in force from August 1. That's how it read. So this was the 1% of the 1% problems we had that we then kind of, I think manually corrected. But that's kind of where we're at now. Everything else in the parsing seemed to look pretty good to us in the small sample that we checked. Right.
Great. Thank you for covering the technical stuff. Okay, so once we got through that stage, once we had checked both for data loss and accuracy of parsing, we were able to draw some broad conclusions about the publishing industry in England during this period. So one thing maybe more interesting to me than most people is the top publishers. You can see that like even our top publisher, Hodder and Stoughton, published 3,000 books in a 10-year period. That is orders of magnitude less than publishers publish now, right? So even though this is the largest English language publishing industry in the world at the time, it's producing 10 to 15,000 books titles a year. So we can see some of those big institutions. Another thing that I want to highlight is that some of these still exist, right? Which is pretty unusual in our current conglomerate publishing landscape where most presses have merged. And I can talk more about that. But places like Macmillan, Cambridge, Milford is actually Oxford University Press, are still around. We can see a big shift in the formats in which books are published from how they used to be in the 19th century. Specifically, this designation up here, Crown Octavo, that's like the size of what we now would think of as like a traditional paperback, right? So that wasn't always the standard size of books. Paper was expensive. It was the most expensive part of a book. And so we see books getting smaller and being made more affordable for a wider range of audiences. Perhaps most interesting, though, is the top authors of this period. Siddharth and I both study the 20th century and 21st century in your case. These top authors are top 2 authors in the data set I had not heard of before I did this work, right? So William LeQue, he was a detective fiction writer, and Charles Garvice was a romance writer. So those same kind of popular genres that we see being popular today, but which are sometimes not what is most studied in English or literary studies departments, are rising to the top here. We also, among our top 5 authors, were Shakespeare and Dickens. They never go away. They stay strong. They are getting published every year. And then down here, Siddharth has very helpfully added a few famous modernist authors, James Joyce and Virginia Woolf, and you can see how much less they're publishing. They're not publishing editions every year at this time. So there is more we could say about the kinds of conclusions that we can draw from this. We've looked at particular authors within this larger data set. We've also looked at particular genres. I looked specifically at songs and ballads in these titles. But basically, we wanted to highlight that we can get a different picture of the publishing industry by using these kinds of historical sources, and that a combination of very attentive human labor and collaborative human labor coupled with the new affordances of LLMs can really help us unlock sources, historical sources, in a new way that wasn't possible. Even, for example, when I first encountered the English Catalogue of Books, when I was a grad student, this all seemed like a pipe dream. I did not see how it could happen. And so teaming up with Siddharth and getting to actually take this across the finish line has been a real dream. So thank you for listening to our presentation. We're happy to take questions.